The sun was just beginning to drop behind the buildings when Leonard pulled out of the courthouse parking lot. It had been another long day filled with meetings, case reviews, and quiet moments of reflection about the work he did. He wasn't the kind of man who bragged about his job. Most people in town didn't even know that he was a federal prosecutor. He liked keeping his life simple. He drove an old sedan, wore plain suits, and lived in a modest house with his wife and 2 kids on the edge of the city. The streets were quiet that evening. Leonard loosened his tie and turned on the radio, trying to relax. It was one of those moments when the world felt calm, where nothing seemed urgent. But that calm didn't last long. As he drove down a wide suburban road, he noticed a police cruiser parked behind a tree near a gas station. The flashing lights came on suddenly, followed by a sharp siren. Leonard looked in his mirror, puzzled. He wasn't speeding, his seatbelt was on, and his car was in perfect condition. Still, he pulled over calmly, as anyone should. The officer approached quickly, hand already resting on his belt. Leonard rolled down the window and greeted him politely. The officer didn't respond. Instead, he peered inside the car, his tone sharp as he asked for license and registration. Leonard handed them over immediately, his movements careful and respectful. Then came the first strange question. The officer asked where Leonard was coming from. When Leonard replied, saying he was just leaving work from the federal courthouse downtown, the officer frowned and asked again, this time slower, as if he didn't believe it. Leonard repeated his answer, adding that he worked for the federal government. He even mentioned that his office handled legal cases for the state. But the officer's expression stayed cold. He didn't bother to check the ID properly. Instead, he asked Leonard to step out of the car. Leonard's stomach tightened. He knew how easily these situations could go wrong. Still, he stayed calm, unbuckled his seatbelt, and stepped out with his hands visible. A few passing cars slowed down as people looked to see what was happening. The officer told him to put his hands on the hood. Leonard hesitated, confused. He asked if there was a problem. The officer snapped at him to do as he was told. Leonard did, trying not to show his frustration. The metal of the car hood was warm against his palms. Another police car pulled up, and a second officer stepped out, watching closely. Leonard's heart began to pound, not because he was guilty of anything, but because of how helpless he suddenly felt. He had spent years inside courtrooms defending justice, but here he was, standing on the side of the road, treated like a criminal. The first officer began questioning him again, asking if he owned the car, where he got it, and why he was in the neighborhood. Leonard answered each question patiently. The officer didn't seem interested in listening. He mentioned that the car looked like one used in a robbery earlier that day. Leonard explained that he had been in meetings all afternoon and could prove it, but the officer wasn't listening. By now, a few bystanders had started recording with their phones. Leonard could hear the low hum of whispers around him. He felt the weight of those eyes, the curiosity, the pity, the judgment. His throat felt dry, but he refused to raise his voice or show anger. He knew that one wrong tone could make things worse. When the officer finally told him he was being detained for questioning, Leonard asked politely if he could retrieve his work ID from the car trunk. He explained that it would show who he was. The officer refused and told him to stay still. Moments later, Leonard felt cold metal wrap around his wrists. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was sharp and humiliating. He stood there, staring at the ground as the officer read something from his notepad. People around whispered louder now. Someone muttered that it didn't look right. Another said that the man in cuffs looked like he worked for the government. Leonard kept breathing slowly, trying to control the rush of heat in his chest. He had spent his entire career believing that fairness and justice were the foundations of the system he served. Yet in that moment, standing on the side of the road with handcuffs on, he realized how fragile dignity could be when someone refused to see you for who you really were. The officer pushed him gently toward the back seat of the cruiser. The door closed with a heavy sound, trapping him inside. Through the window, Leonard saw his car still parked neatly by the curb, his briefcase sitting in the passenger seat. Inside it, his official ID, court documents, and letters with his name printed under the seal of the United States Department of Justice. The ride to the station was silent. The radio crackled with background chatter from other officers, but no one spoke to him. Leonard watched the lights pass by outside, stores closing, families walking home, people laughing at outdoor cafes. All those small, ordinary moments he loved about his city seemed far away now. When they arrived at the station, he was led inside and asked to sit in a holding room. The officer who brought him in filled out paperwork without saying a word to him. Leonard sat there quietly, still in his work clothes, feeling every second stretch longer than it should. A younger officer walked in, glanced at Leonard, and looked confused. Leonard noticed the hesitation and took the chance to speak. He explained, calmly, who he was, that there had been a mistake, that his identification proving everything was still in his briefcase. The younger officer nodded uncertainly and left the room. Leonard waited. Minutes turned into an hour. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he couldn't answer it. His wife must have been calling. He was supposed to be home for dinner by now. He imagined her waiting, wondering why he wasn't picking up. He imagined his kids asking where he was. 2 more officers entered and asked him standard questions: name, address, occupation. When Leonard mentioned again that he was a federal prosecutor, one of them laughed, thinking he was joking. The other wrote something on a clipboard and told him to sit tight. Eventually, they fingerprinted him, took his photo, and placed him in a small cell with 2 other men. The cell smelled of stale air and concrete. One of the men sitting on the bench looked up and squinted. Recognition crossed his face. "Hey, aren't you that lawyer from downtown?" he asked quietly. Leonard nodded slightly. The man looked shocked. "What are you doing in here?" Leonard didn't have an answer. He just shook his head and gave a small smile. The other man whispered something under his breath, something about how unfair things could be. Time passed slowly in that cell. Leonard leaned against the wall, eyes closed, replaying the entire traffic stop in his mind. He had done everything right. He had stayed calm, polite, respectful. None of it mattered. He had been judged before a single word came out of his mouth. Around midnight, he heard raised voices outside the cell. Someone was arguing. He recognized one of the voices as the young officer from earlier. The words weren't clear, but it sounded like confusion mixed with disbelief. Then came hurried footsteps, a door opening, and the sound of keys jingling. Leonard didn't know it yet, but at that very moment, one of his colleagues at the courthouse had begun calling around after realizing he never showed up for a scheduled meeting. They checked with security, tracked his last known location, and discovered that his phone signal had stopped near the local police station. Calls began pouring into the department, asking for answers. Inside the cell, Leonard kept his composure, but inside his chest, anger and sadness mixed like heavy smoke, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated as less than human because of assumptions. He thought of all the cases he had worked on, all the people he had tried to help. And now, he was living the same kind of injustice he had fought against for years. The night dragged on. The cold from the concrete bench seeped through his clothes. He thought about his wife again, how worried she must be. He thought about his kids sleeping in their rooms, unaware that their father was sitting behind bars for nothing. Finally, sometime past 1 a.m, the cell door opened again. A senior officer stepped inside, looking uncomfortable. He asked Leonard to come with him. They walked silently through the hall, past the desks and fluorescent lights to a small office. The officer offered him water, then said in a quiet voice that there had been a mistake. Leonard didn't reply. He just looked at the man, his eyes calm but steady. He was told that someone was verifying his identity and that it looked like everything would be cleared up soon. Leonard simply nodded. He had no energy left to argue, no words left to prove who he was. When they finally let him make a phone call, he dialed his wife first. Her voice cracked with relief. He told her not to worry, that he was fine, and that he'd be home soon. He hung up before she could ask too many questions. As the minutes passed, Leonard sat quietly, waiting for the truth to catch up with the mistake. Outside, dawn was still hours away. Inside the station, the truth was beginning to surface. Leonard sat quietly in the holding cell, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. His hands were still sore from the handcuffs, but he refused to show anger or frustration. He had learned over the years that losing control never helped anyone. Around him, other men murmured quietly, some curious, some indifferent. One man kept glancing at him, clearly trying to piece together who he was. Leonard recognized the look, the mixture of surprise and disbelief that came from seeing someone in a place they clearly didn't belong. Minutes passed slowly. Leonard thought about how quickly life could change. One moment he had been leaving the courthouse, ready to go home to his family. The next he was sitting in a cell, treated like a criminal. He wondered how many people experienced this every day, how many were judged before being heard, and how many were caught in situations beyond their control. A door opened, and a young officer walked in carrying a clipboard. Leonard could see him hesitating at the threshold, unsure of what to say. He introduced himself politely and asked Leonard some standard questions: full name, date of birth, occupation. When Leonard mentioned that he worked as a federal prosecutor, the officer blinked and looked down at his notes. "That can't be right," the young officer muttered quietly to himself. Leonard, keeping calm, offered to explain and mentioned that all his identification was in his briefcase, still in the car trunk. The officer hesitated, glanced at the senior officers outside the cell, then nodded. He promised to check. Time dragged on, but eventually a commotion began in the station. Leonard could hear raised voices, hurried footsteps, and the sound of phones ringing. Someone was talking about a missing federal prosecutor, and it sounded serious. Leonard's pulse quickened. He had seen situations like this in courtrooms, but never from the other side of the desk. He had argued countless cases for people accused of crimes they didn't commit. Now he was the accused, and it was the truth that was his only defense. Leonard's thoughts drifted to his colleagues at the courthouse. They must have noticed his absence by now. He thought about his assistant, who was usually very organized, keeping track of schedules and meetings. She had probably called multiple offices, wondering why he hadn't shown up. He hoped they would find him soon. Suddenly, the door to the holding area opened and a senior officer appeared. He walked toward Leonard slowly, a folder in his hand. Leonard's heart beat faster, though he stayed calm on the outside. The officer introduced himself and said that someone had contacted the chief about a mistake. Leonard nodded, keeping his voice steady. He didn't want to appear relieved or vulnerable. He wanted to remain composed. The officer began checking Leonard's information against the records. Leonard watched as names, addresses, and identification numbers were compared. Every moment felt like a test, a silent question of whether the truth could prove itself against assumptions. He noticed the skeptical glances from some of the younger officers. It was clear they had never seen this happen before. A well-dressed black man, calm, polite, and clearly educated, sitting in a holding cell while the system tried to figure out what went wrong. One of the officers finally asked Leonard to explain his job again. He spoke quietly and clearly, describing his work as a federal prosecutor, the types of cases he handled, and the offices he visited. He mentioned that his identification and credentials were in the briefcase still in his car. The officer nodded slowly, then left to verify the information. Leonard sat back, breathing slowly. Around him, the murmurs in the holding cell continued. The man on the bench looked at Leonard with a mix of awe and curiosity. "So you really work for the government?" he asked quietly. Leonard nodded, giving a small smile. "Yes, I handle cases in federal court." The man shook his head. "And they arrested you?" Leonard shrugged slightly. "They made a mistake. I'm sure they will fix it soon." The man leaned back, still staring. "I've seen people treated unfairly before, but this is different. You've got to be careful out here." Leonard nodded, thinking about how often people were judged by appearances. He had seen it countless times in court, people making assumptions, believing what they wanted without checking the facts. Now he felt the sting of that judgment personally, and it was sharper than anything he had experienced before. Hours seemed to pass slowly. Leonard could hear the occasional door opening, officers moving about, and the hum of fluorescent lights. He tried not to focus on the time, knowing that waiting angrily would only make the situation worse. Instead, he thought about his family, his work, and the importance of remaining calm in the face of injustice. Finally, a familiar voice called out his name. Leonard looked up and saw one of his colleagues, a senior attorney from the federal office, walking toward him with a determined expression. Behind her, several other officials followed, all looking serious. Leonard's heart lifted slightly, but he kept his composure. The senior attorney approached the officers at the front desk, speaking in firm, clear tones. Leonard could hear fragments of the conversation, words like federal prosecutor, wrongful arrest, and verify identity. The officers looked uncomfortable, some avoiding eye contact, others scribbling quickly on notepads. Moments later, an officer came back to Leonard's cell. He unlocked the door and gestured for him to follow. Leonard walked calmly, his head held high, though inside he felt a mixture of relief and lingering tension. The hallway seemed longer than it was, each step a reminder of the unfairness he had faced. They led him into a small office where his credentials were spread across the desk. Leonard pointed to his identification and documents. The senior attorney checked them, nodding in confirmation. She looked at the officers and said firmly, "This man is a federal prosecutor. He was arrested in error." The room was silent for a moment. Leonard's expression was calm, but inside he felt a weight lifting. He had been caught in a situation that no amount of preparation could prevent. He had stayed composed, respectful, and patient, and the truth had finally reached the people who needed to see it. The officer who had made the arrest looked down, clearly embarrassed. He muttered something about following procedure, but Leonard didn't respond. There was no need for words. The situation had already spoken for itself. Leonard was asked to sit while the paperwork was corrected. His fingerprints and booking information were being removed from the system. Other officers peered curiously at the files, realizing just how serious the mistake had been. Leonard's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the tension in the room. After what felt like an eternity, Leonard was finally free to leave the station. He stepped outside into the cool night air. The first hints of dawn were visible on the horizon, painting the sky with soft colors. Leonard breathed deeply, feeling the fresh air fill his lungs. He had been through something humiliating, frustrating, and unfair, but he had come through it without losing his dignity. As he walked to his car, people on the street stopped and stared. Some whispered, others pulled out their phones. Leonard ignored them, focused only on getting back home to his family. The world had watched him, judged him, and questioned him, but he had remained himself through it all. When he reached his car, he retrieved his briefcase and checked his phone. Missed calls from his wife and assistant filled the screen. He called his wife first, hearing the relief in her voice. She had been worried sick, imagining all kinds of things. Leonard reassured her calmly, telling her he was fine and on his way home. Driving back, Leonard reflected on what had happened. He thought about how quickly life could turn, how assumptions could harm even someone who had dedicated their life to justice. He thought about the people in the holding cell with him, the ones who might not have the same opportunities to prove themselves. He realized that the incident was more than just a personal humiliation. It was a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. By the time Leonard reached home, the sky had lightened into early morning. His kids were asleep, his wife was still awake, waiting anxiously by the door. He hugged her tightly, feeling the comfort of being back in a safe space. They didn't need words to express what had happened. The experience had been enough to show them both the fragility of trust in people who are supposed to protect you. Leonard went inside, his briefcase under his arm, and sat down with his wife. They talked quietly, discussing what had happened and what needed to be done next. Leonard knew that while the personal incident was over, the implications were far from resolved. Policies needed to change, awareness needed to increase, and the culture of assumptions and bias had to be challenged. Even in the quiet of his home, Leonard felt the weight of responsibility. Not just for himself, but for everyone who could find themselves in a similar situation. He thought about the people he had represented, the cases he had won, and the justice he had fought for. Now he understood more personally than ever how important it was to fight not just in courtrooms, but in the everyday moments where fairness and recognition were often denied. Leonard spent the morning planning his next steps. He would call the chief of police, speak with his colleagues, and make sure this incident was addressed. But first, he needed to be with his family, to feel the normalcy that had been stripped away from him for a few hours. As the sun fully rose, Leonard sat with his coffee, looking out at the queueway. The news of Leonard's arrest spread quickly through the courthouse and beyond. By the time he left the police station, several of his colleagues had already arrived to meet him. Their faces were a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. Leonard remained calm, his voice steady as he explained the sequence of events. He told them exactly how the officer had treated him, how he had been handcuffed, fingerprinted, and placed in a cell, and how his credentials had been ignored. His colleagues listened quietly, some shaking their heads, others rubbing their foreheads in frustration. It was hard for them to comprehend that someone who worked every day for justice could be subjected to such treatment in his own city. Leonard's calm demeanor, even after such humiliation, seemed to make the story even more powerful. He wasn't angry at them or at the people outside who had seen him arrested. He was focused on what needed to be done next. Calls to the chief of police were made immediately. Leonard spoke directly with him, explaining his identity and the error that had taken place. The chief, a man who had spent decades in law enforcement, sounded uncomfortable. He admitted that there had been a mistake and promised a full review of the incident. Leonard appreciated the acknowledgement but insisted that a simple apology wasn't enough. He wanted the department to examine how assumptions about race could lead to wrongful arrests, and he wanted this incident to be used as a learning opportunity. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse and the police station, the story had already started to spread. Word of mouth, combined with social media posts from bystanders who had recorded parts of the traffic stop, meant that within hours, Leonard's arrest had become a public discussion. The headline was simple but striking: Federal Prosecutor wrongfully arrested in suburban town. People across the city, and even in neighboring towns, were reading about it. Sharing their disbelief and outrage, journalists began calling the courthouse. Leonard's office had to handle the media carefully. He was known for his humility and discretion, so they wanted to ensure his story was told accurately. Leonard agreed to a brief statement, emphasizing that he had been cooperative throughout the incident and that his goal now was not personal revenge, but systemic change. He wanted to make sure that other people wouldn't have to go through what he had experienced simply because of assumptions about their appearance. Back at the police department, the officer who had made the arrest faced intense scrutiny. His superiors demanded a written statement, detailing exactly why he had pulled Leonard over and why he had failed to check his identification. The officer's initial confidence began to falter under the weight of public attention and the reality that his actions were now being questioned by both federal authorities and his own. Department Leonard's calm and composed approach stood in stark contrast to the officer's growing discomfort. He didn't shout or make accusations in public. Instead, he spoke with quiet authority, explaining that the arrest was based on a false assumption and that it was a clear example of how bias could impact real lives. His words carried weight not because of anger or outrage, but because of the truth behind them and the way he had handled himself throughout the ordeal. As the day continued, Leonard's story became a point of discussion in multiple circles. Community leaders reached out, expressing concern and asking what they could do to support him and ensure such incidents didn't happen again. Legal organizations began planning forums to discuss the role of bias in policing. Leonard, despite his exhaustion, agreed to participate, knowing that turning his personal experience into a lesson for others could prevent future injustices. The police department held an emergency meeting to address the growing public concern. The chief acknowledged the mistake publicly for the first time. He admitted that the officer had failed to verify Leonard's identity and had acted on assumptions rather than facts. While some officers were defensive, others understood the seriousness of the situation. Leonard's calm professionalism in handling the aftermath had made it clear that this was not a personal attack, but a systemic issue that required careful attention. Throughout the day, Leonard received messages from colleagues and friends. Many were astonished at the speed at which events had unfolded. Some offered support, others shared their own experiences with wrongful stops or discrimination. Leonard listened, taking note of each story, recognizing a pattern that went far beyond his personal experience. He realized that the incident was part of a larger problem, one that required more than apologies. It required action and awareness. As evening approached, Leonard sat down with the chief and a few senior officers. He explained what had happened step by step, pointing out where the situation could have been handled differently. He was firm but not confrontational. He made clear that the goal was to prevent such incidents in the future, not to punish anyone personally. His perspective, shaped by years of working in the law, emphasized fairness, accountability, and education rather than blame. The officer who had arrested him was present but silent. Leonard looked directly at him, not with anger but with a quiet authority that spoke volumes. He explained that assumptions, especially about race, could lead to harm even when intentions were meant to enforce the law. Leonard's words were measured, and they carried the weight of someone who had spent his life pursuing justice. The officer nodded slightly, realizing the seriousness of his actions in a way that no reprimand alone could have conveyed. Outside the department, news crews had begun gathering. They spoke to bystanders who had witnessed Leonard's arrest, and many described the situation with disbelief and sympathy. People shared their recordings online, highlighting how polite and composed Leonard had remained despite the treatment he received. The images and videos circulated widely, reinforcing the narrative that injustice had occurred and that it was being addressed with care and transparency. Within the courthouse, Leonard's colleagues continued to rally around him. They began drafting official statements, coordinating with city officials, and preparing for a public response that emphasized both the injustice and the need for constructive change. Leonard, though tired, participated actively, ensuring that the story was framed in a way that highlighted fairness, accountability, and the importance of addressing systemic issues rather than personal grievances. By the next morning, Leonard's story had reached national attention. Headlines highlighted the key facts. A federal prosecutor had been arrested in error. The arrest had been based on a false assumption, and the incident was prompting an immediate review of police procedures. Leonard's calm and measured approach to the situation was widely praised, contrasting sharply with the initial aggression of the officer who had detained him. Community leaders scheduled meetings to discuss racial profiling and bias in law enforcement. Leonard agreed to attend, recognizing that his personal experience could serve as a valuable example. He wanted to show that even someone in a position of authority and respect could be subjected to injustice, and that the response needed to focus on education, reform, and accountability. Throughout the day, Leonard reflected on the events. He thought about the power of composure, the importance of truth, and the need to use personal experiences to effect change. He realized that while the incident had been humiliating, it had also provided a rare opportunity to highlight systemic issues and advocate for fairness. He felt a sense of responsibility, not anger, not resentment, but a quiet determination to ensure that lessons were learned. By mid-afternoon, the chief of police issued a public statement acknowledging the mistake and promising a full investigation. He emphasized that the arrest had been wrongful and that steps would be taken to prevent similar incidents in the future. Leonard's colleagues shared the news with him quietly, knowing that while it didn't undo the experience, it was a meaningful step toward accountability. The officer who had made the arrest was placed on administrative leave pending review. Leonard understood the decision. It wasn't about punishment, but about creating space for reflection and change. He believed that the officer could learn from the experience, just as the department could improve its policies and procedures. By evening, Leonard returned home. His family had waited anxiously, relieved to see him safe. He hugged them tightly, feeling the comfort of normalcy after the chaos of the previous hours. While the incident had been traumatic, it had also shown the importance of standing firm, remaining calm, and allowing the truth to guide the response. Later that night, Leonard sat quietly in his study, reviewing notes and messages from colleagues and community members. He thought about the power of awareness and the need for systemic change. He knew that his story was now more than a personal account. It was a symbol of the need for fairness, accountability, and education within law enforcement. Leonard also reflected on the public reaction. The support from his community, the attention from colleagues, and the discussions sparked by his experience showed him that change was possible when truth was presented calmly and clearly. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that his response could help prevent similar incidents for others in the future. By the end of the day, Leonard felt exhausted but resolute. He had faced humiliation, bias, and false assumptions, yet he had maintained his dignity and use. The morning after Leonard's release, the courthouse buzzed with quiet urgency. Colleagues whispered in hallways, discussing what had happened, sharing the news that had spread so quickly online. Leonard moved through the office with calm determination, greeting people with his usual quiet nods, but inside, his mind was focused on the work ahead. The arrest had been resolved, but the larger issues it revealed were far from settled. Leonard called his assistant first, asking her to gather all the relevant files, emails and documentation from the previous day. He wanted to make sure that every step of his interaction with the police department was recorded, not for revenge, but to ensure transparency and accountability. His goal was simple: prevent this from happening to anyone else. Within hours, the chief of police reached out to schedule a meeting. Leonard accepted, knowing that face-to-face discussions were the only way real change could begin. When he entered the office, he was greeted by the chief and a few senior officers. The room was tense, but Leonard's calm presence seemed to set the tone. He didn't come with anger or accusations. He came with a clear message. "I'm not here to punish anyone," Leonard said quietly but firmly. "What happened yesterday was wrong. It was avoidable, and it shouldn't happen again. This is about creating systems that protect everyone, not about pointing fingers." The chief listened intently, nodding. Leonard explained the sequence of events step by step, highlighting where assumptions and bias had influenced the officer's decisions. He spoke about the importance of verification, the need to check identification carefully, and the dangers of acting on stereotypes. His words were precise but not harsh. He spoke as someone who understood the law, the responsibility of law enforcement, and the real human consequences when mistakes like this were made. The officers in the room shifted uncomfortably. They could feel the weight of the situation, and it was clear that Leonard's calm authority made the reality of the mistake undeniable. One officer asked a question about what could be done differently. Leonard smiled faintly. "Training, awareness, policy changes. We need to build a culture where assumptions don't replace facts." By mid-morning, word of the planned review had spread throughout the department. Other officers began to discuss the incident quietly among themselves. Some were defensive, feeling that the officer who had arrested Leonard had acted in good faith. Others recognized the seriousness of the error and began to reflect on how they themselves might have reacted in a similar situation. Leonard's story was not just about one arrest. It was a mirror showing the department what could happen if bias went unchecked. Outside the courthouse, community leaders had begun organizing meetings. Leonard agreed to attend, knowing that public dialogue was essential. People wanted to ask questions, understand what had happened, and learn how to prevent similar incidents. When Leonard arrived at the community center, he was greeted by a room filled with residents, local officials, and representatives from civil rights groups. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful. Leonard spoke calmly and clearly, recounting the incident without exaggeration or dramatization. He described the arrest, the moment in the holding cell, and the verification of his identity. But he focused on the broader message, that assumptions and bias could harm anyone, regardless of education, position, or accomplishments. He emphasized the importance of communication, accountability, and empathy in law enforcement. Residents listened closely. Some nodded in understanding, others asked questions about what policies could change. Leonard explained that officers should be trained not only in procedures, but in understanding the human consequences of their actions. He highlighted the need for community engagement, dialogue, and listening to citizens' concerns. By noon, media outlets had begun covering the community meetings. Leonard was careful in his interviews, stressing that his goal was systemic change, not personal attention. He wanted to ensure that the focus remained on reform, on preventing future incidents, and on building trust between law enforcement and the community. His calm and measured tone resonated with many viewers, and social media posts praising his composure began circulating widely. Back at the police department, the officer who had arrested Leonard faced internal interviews. He was asked to recount every decision he had made, every observation, and every instruction he had given. Leonard had insisted that the review be thorough but fair, focusing on improvement rather than punishment. The officer admitted that he had acted too quickly, relying on assumptions rather than verification. His words were awkward but honest, and for the first time, He seemed to understand the impact of his actions. Leonard continued meeting with city officials, police leadership, and community members throughout the day. He emphasized three main points: verification, bias awareness, and accountability. Every conversation reinforced the same message. Justice is not just a concept in the courtroom. It begins in everyday decisions and actions. By late afternoon, the mayor called a press conference. Leonard attended, standing beside city leaders as they addressed the incident publicly. The mayor apologized for the wrongful arrest, acknowledged the officer's mistake, and announced that a full review of police procedures would take place. Leonard spoke briefly, his voice calm and steady. He thanked the city for responding seriously and emphasized that this was a moment to learn, not just a moment to apologize. Community groups applauded the transparency. Local civil rights organizations praised Leonard's approach, noting that his calm and measured response set an example for how individuals could address systemic issues without escalating conflict. Leonard had turned a personal humiliation into a platform for education and reform. As evening approached, Leonard returned home, exhausted but satisfied that progress was being made. He sat with his family, sharing only a little of the day's events to spare them from stress, but the weight of responsibility stayed with him. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but the first steps had been taken. Policies would be reviewed, officers would receive training, and conversations about bias would continue in the community. That night, Leonard reflected on what he had learned. Even in a system he had devoted his life to, assumptions could lead to harm. The experience reminded him that justice was fragile, and that protecting it required constant vigilance. But he also realized that calmness, clarity, and truth could be powerful tools in confronting injustice. He had faced humiliation and bias directly, and by staying composed, he had been able to turn the situation into a catalyst for change. Over the next few days, Leonard worked with the police department to design training sessions focused on bias awareness and proper verification procedures. He insisted that officers understand the human impact of their decisions and that accountability be part of the process. Officers across the department began attending sessions, some skeptical at first, but most slowly recognizing the value of what they were learning. Leonard spoke not as a critic but as a partner in building a safer, fairer system. Community leaders continued holding forums, with Leonard present to answer questions and provide perspective. Residents shared stories of their own experiences, and Leonard listened carefully, taking notes and offering guidance. He emphasized that reform was a collective effort, requiring cooperation between citizens, officials, and law enforcement. His presence added credibility to the discussions, and his calm approach helped keep conversations productive rather than confrontational. The officer who had arrested Leonard began attending training sessions as well. At first, he avoided eye contact and kept his distance, but over time he started to engage, asking questions and listening. Leonard didn't single him out or shame him. Instead, he encouraged understanding and growth. Slowly, the officer began to grasp how assumptions had guided his actions and how careful verification could prevent future mistakes. Through these efforts, the police department began to shift its approach. Policies were updated to require officers to confirm identification thoroughly before making arrests. Bias awareness became a regular part of training, not an occasional lecture. Leonard's involvement ensured that the reforms were meaningful, not just symbolic. Meanwhile, the community responded positively. Local leaders noted that Leonard's story had sparked important conversations. Residents appreciated that a person in a position of authority had experienced what so many others had faced, and had used the experience to promote positive change rather than seek revenge. The incident became a case study in calm, constructive action, showing that even difficult and unjust situations could lead to progress. Leonard returned to his work at the courthouse, resuming his cases with renewed focus. He found that his own experience gave him a deeper understanding of the people he represented, especially those who faced bias or unfair treatment. It reminded him why his work mattered and why he had chosen this path in the first place. By the end of the week, the police department issued a formal report summarizing the findings of the review. It acknowledged that the arrest had been wrongful, outlined the steps being taken to prevent future errors, and emphasized the importance of bias awareness. Leonard read the report carefully. noting that while it couldn't undo the personal experience, it represented a meaningful step forward for the entire commune.